Yeah, so that's always how it goes, right? That's the same reason we came out here. My wife had an opportunity, and it's just
Yeah.
us creative types are just like, ah, you can do
I
that
was
anywhere. You do that
I
anywhere,
was
right?
gonna say you can write anywhere, you can do the creative anywhere. You know, it used to be being in LA was more important, but a lot of it's Zooms now, and a lot of it has changed. And I'm only a 6 hour drive away or 1 hour flight if I need to be there. Make sure that's off.
Yeah, that's interesting. I want to talk to you about that too. How the industry's kind of changed, even in the just the last 5 years. You know, like just
Yeah,
it's incredible. I mean, I see this in publishing. I see this, yeah, film, music. We just had a musician on the other day, and he was saying the same thing. Like it's kind of the last 5 years has been this huge seismic shift in all of the creative industries, like how the businesses are set up, and so yeah, we're
yeah,
fascinated about that here. But
yeah. I'm happy to talk about it.
yeah,
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy, heavy, heavy.
Bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. No! Inner
Resources.
life, friends, is boring. We must not say so.
this is Andrew Whitstadt, and you were listening to Heavy Board, and we're recording this on March 1st, 2025. My guest today is Josh Mendoza. Josh is an award-winning filmmaker. He's a film producer, a director, a screenwriter, a storyteller, an entrepreneur, a CEO, and Josh is also a novelist. His debut sci-fi novel, Shadow of the Eternal Watcher, was published just this year, in late January 2025, from Inkshares. Josh founded Strike the Sun Entertainment, a media and production company. His films have been shown, recognized, and awarded at festivals all over. And his feature film directorial debut, What Still Remains, from 2018, was called a hidden gem on Netflix. And Mendoza himself was praised by the LA Times for finding a fresh angle on the post-apocalyptic thriller. Josh is a Stanford man, receiving his degree in English and creative writing, and he's an alumni of USC's prestigious School of Cinematic Arts, where he received his MFA, which we will get to, listeners. He's a father, a creative, a post-apocalypse mastermind. I'm very pleased to welcome Josh Mendoza onto Heavy Board today. Josh, thanks so much for coming on Heavy Board.
Well, thanks for having me, Andrew. I'm excited to be here, and you make me sound so good there. I appreciate it.
Good, good. Yeah, I'm glad. I
No, I'm
try to.
excited to chat.
Yeah, I think it's best to butter up the guests before we get started. No, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean it. Whenever I do that, I try to go in depth with all this. So yeah, I appreciate that. We start this off with this first question we ask all artists and writers that come on this podcast. What was your childhood like? Where did you grow up? What did your parents do? How did these kind of early years start to form, Josh Mendoza?
Yes. So I grew up in Arizona. I'm from a place called Ahwatukee. It's in Phoenix. It's the suburbs. When we moved here, it was very new, a lot of desert, and what is now like the movie theater there was like a junkyard. So it was like, you know, we were the expansion southwards, and everyone was like, "Oh, why would you move out there? It's so far away." But now it's a place people want to be, and it's beautiful. And growing up there, it was great. I mean, we had a little small indie bookstore my mom used to take me to. I mean, I always talk about I have vivid memories of just sitting in the sci-fi section there and reading. And my dad he didn't know it, but he was a big cinephile. He watched a lot of TV, rented a lot of movies. He always wanted us watching something. And I think it just really sculpted my early days as a creative that I had parents who were both into movies and into reading. And I've continued that into my adulthood with my kids too. So lucky. I mean, neither of my parents do the creative realm. My dad's actually in sales, and I've done that with him too, with real estate. And it's a different world. But like I said, you never know who's influencing you as a young person. So it was a great childhood, and I excited to be here now,
Yeah,
telling
yeah.
stories.
Yeah, it's always interesting too because especially in America, like, there's that American story where you can come from anywhere, essentially, any little part of the country, and kind of just the cliche is find your way to the big city. But yeah, that's fantastic. What you said your dad was in sales? He was real estate with.
Yeah, real estate, and he still does it. And I did that in LA and in Phoenix with him too. It's a great thing when you're a creative to have a job that's a little flexible in your hours. So it lent itself very easily to time blocking and being able to be like, okay, right now I'm going to write for 2 hours and I'm going to do this for 2 hours, and it helps pay the bills, which we have to do as well as creatives. So
Yeah.
it was a good springboard for me there.
And it's people always underestimate too how much of kind of being a creative is sales. Like you're selling yourself. You got to pitch your projects. You got to pitch your articles, your books. You're trying to sell yourself. So I mean, that's always great background to start with.
And I was going to say, when I went to USC, I would say that a lot, and people always want me to produce their movies because I am good at talking to people. I learned that from my dad, and it's a people business, and so is writing, and so is reading, and so is filmmaking. And I think you have to just be able to express yourself. And, you can write something great, but if you can't boil it down into little segments for people, a lot of times they won't even read it. A lot of times when you're pitching a book, they read like a chapter. So you have to really be able to like dial it down into like a very digestible, what is it? I get a vibe for that. And, elevator pitches are very important. And I know there's probably a lot of people out there rolling their eyes and I don't want to do that. And it just is a necessary evil that you have to be able to express and communicate with other people what you're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great. Again, I know people don't like to hear it a lot of times. We'd like to just sit in our rooms by ourselves and do creative. But listeners out there, It's good to hear. Yeah. And what did your mother do? Did your mother work, or did you?
My mom was a school teacher and then was also in the exercise physiology world as well. And she worked with mentally challenged children in her earlier days. And then as I got older, she stayed at home with us.
Right. It's incredible how many writers and kind of artists have like a teacher in the family, like a teacher and a parent that was a teacher or has education background, where this, it really comes into handy where it's like, oh, how do you learn about all this stuff? It's like, well, my parents actually, like my mother and my father, they were teachers and they would give me these books, and yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah. And that was one of the main reasons we moved. We talked about Ahwatukee earlier. We moved out here because the schools were good and my mom wanted us to go. They were brand new at the time, but Kyrene had a great school district and she wanted us to be in it. And it really shaped our childhood, was education. And I mean, my mom's mantra was always like, first you go to high school, then you're going to go to college, you get a job, then maybe you go back to college, get a graduate degree, then you get married, then you have kids. So she drilled that into me, that like education was important and valuable. And, I think sometimes nowadays too, you hear people deride college educations, and I don't think they're for everyone necessarily, but I sort of see it the same way I see reading too, is like, get out there, meeting different types of people, different cultures, different opinions and viewpoints. It really just shapes you as a human being. And I think that's true when you read too. You get into other people's mindsets, other people's points of view, and there's nothing more invaluable than being able to see the world through different lenses than what you're raised with.
Yeah. That's always one of the most important parts too. Like, it's just, I hate that when people are talking about like education, but college is a waste of time. I'm like, that's why we talk about MFAs on this podcast all the time too. It's like a theme, the graduate study in art, because people are like, oh, it's useless. And if you're talking about going into making six figures right out of grad school, yeah, sure, it's not very useful for that, but it's actually incredibly useful for other things. And yeah, it's always people throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So anyway, yes, getting on with this, when did reading and writing come into your life? You said this was something your parents emphasized. Like, were you always a big reader? Is this something that you came to later in life? How did that go for you? When did reading and writing come in?
I was always a big reader. I mean, I was 7-8 years old, like I said, sitting in the back room of that small little bookstore, just in the sci-fi section, just devouring books. And I always used to walk around and imagine, where would my book be if I wrote something? And I'd be next to Herman Melville over here. I'd be over here in this section. So it was always a big part of my life. And I always had a dream of stories. And it wasn't probably till high school I started to say, I think I want to be a writer.
Right.
And And I would tell people that, and I remember someone being like, "Well, don't you have to already be good at writing? Like, how are you going to be a writer?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm okay at writing, but I'm going to practice and get better, right?" But I just, I'm just a do it kind of guy. I chased it. I went to Stanford, like you mentioned, and I was taking a lot of creative writing classes and pursuing that. And while I was there, I took a film noir class, and it was really the first time in my life I ever noticed a cut in a movie. I mean, like I mentioned, I devoured movies. I loved movies. I would always watch the making of movies, but it never really was something that regular human beings did. It was like, oh, Steven Spielberg makes movies, and George Lucas makes movies, and Robert Zemeckis makes movies, and insert famous director here, right?
Right.
And I didn't really. It was in that class. I was like, oh, someone moved the camera, and I could do that. And I don't know. It was just it seemed silly, but I was like 20 years old. I was like, maybe I'll try to do that. And I sort of pivoted away from the novel writing and started focusing on screenwriting, and eventually went to USC's film program and kept chasing that. And it was when I was actually in post-production on my feature film, I had this idea for a big space opera story and also a gritty detective novel. What is a novel? At the time, I was thinking it was going to be a screenplay. And the more I thought about it, I was like, this sounds like a cool idea, but I think it would be a very expensive movie. So it probably would have just turned into one of those things where it's like, hey, this is a calling card. Get me in a room with someone. They read it. They're like, hey, you're a great writer. What else you got? What do you want to do? We love you. But they're not going to make it, right? So when you go into a lot of these pitch meetings too, people will say things like, oh, I wish there was IP attached, intellectual property. I wish there was a graphic novel. I wish there was a book. So I just was, who knows what will happen? But I was like, I'm going to maybe write this as a book, get back to what I originally wanted to do. And that's where the Shadow of the Eternal Watcher was sort of born. It was born out of that idea of those two disparate stories. And I was like, well, how can I mash them up and make a cool story I haven't seen before?
Yeah, absolutely. When were you at Stanford? What years were this?
I was there in 2002 to 2006.
Okay. So I was going to ask if Adam Johnson was there yet. If
Adam Johnson was there, and he was a great teacher. I actually emailed him about this book. He still will speak to me, even though he's quite the prolific writer. He was a great instructor. When I was there, he was well known in the short story world and in the literary world, but he hadn't had the success he's had now with The Orphan Master's Son, which was a brilliant novel. If you haven't read it, everyone should go pick that book up. But Adam really emphasized listening to people. How do they speak? Verisimilitude in your writing. How do you get, when you write dialogue, how do you make it sound like people talking? And I still think about the things he taught to this day, and he was a great instructor. And there were a lot of great. Tom Keeley was another good instructor there at Stanford, and I was very fortunate to be in that because when I'm going to be an English major. I mean, I always wanted to go to Stanford. It was just a dream of mine for some reason, but I wasn't really thinking like, oh, Stanford's got a great English program. I mean, really, you go to Stanford because you want to like be in tech in Silicon Valley. I mean, that's what most people think of, right? And I was just very fortunate and blessed that when I got there was just this great community of people. And I mean, we spoke to it already, but that was the same thing with USC. It's like you're going to these places not to necessarily, you're going to hone a craft, but you're going to meet other creative people and get better at being creative. That's the main goal, right? And my movie is so much better because of the people I met at USC who came and worked on my movie and worked for less than probably they were not probably less. They worked for a scale that they could make a lot more on a different movie, but there was a passion for storytelling, a passion for helping a fellow USC guy. I mean, you're not going to meet the high up people and you're like, oh, they're going to green light something for me. I mean, that may happen for you and that'd be great, but you're really going to meet your contemporary creatives so that as you go through your creative journey, you have people to bounce ideas off of, you have people to read with you and read your stories and tell you what is working and what's not working. And that's really invaluable.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is the reason. I only ask about Johnson just because he's an alumni from McNeese, and that's where I got my MFA. So I only met him once when he came back, and this was, I started my MFA in 2016 and finished in 2019. So
congrats.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So this was post Pulitzer Prize and all when he came. So when he came, everybody's like, Adam Johnson, the Pulitzer Prize winner, but he was great. Yeah, so I'm always
Well,
just
and
curious. Yeah.
I mean, Adam always he just has a energy to him. People fought to get in his classes. I mean, he's
Right.
just a cool guy. I took a class with him. It was called a novel salon, and we just read people's first books and talked about them, and that was cool. That was just a cool class. And even then, I mean, Phil Knight used to fly down from Oregon, and he's the creator of Nike, and he'd take that class with us because he just knew that Adam was a great writer and wanted to be around him. And that was just those are cool experiences. And I also thinking about like, okay, first novels, what are people doing, and how does that come about is sort of valuable as a writer too. Like, is that I always talk to people when they ask me about writing, it's like creating realistic goals about what you're trying to accomplish too. Because you just sit down and you're like, I'm gonna write a book.
Right. It's
sort of like anything, right? I'm going to lose weight. I'm going to get in great shape. I'm going to run a marathon. Well, no, you're not, unless you have a plan, right? And I think that's true of writing too. And I think a lot of people think, oh, you just have to be good, like that person in high school. You have to be good at it. You have to just like it'll just come to you. And there is some of that. I mean, I think there's definitely. I'll talk about sometimes how the muse will just hit you, and I won't even remember writing. And I'll finish and be like, wow, I wrote like thousands of words and they're pretty darn good and I'm going to fix them. And sometimes you'll sit there and stare at the screen and it's like, you're lucky to get 300. But if you have if you sit down and say, okay, every day I sit down, I'm going to write at least 500 words, you're going to get to 80,000 eventually.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fantastic. Yeah. That's the next thing we always ask too is who are the writers that you're kind of enamored with, your kind of inspirations, your go-to, the ones that, you're kind of like, oh yeah, that's my favorite. Who are some of the writers that inspire you, or the ones that you either started you down this path of being a creative and a writer, or ones that you discovered later, the ones that you just go to now, like any of them, all fair game.
Yeah. I mean, when I was younger, I mean, I was highbrow and lowbrow. So I read Herbert, I read Dune, I read Le Guin, I read it all. But I also read a lot of expanded universe Star Wars novels. And so, I mean, I devoured books. And I think when I got to college, I was like shying away from some of the more pulpy stuff I love. And I do love it. And I still love it. And I was like, oh, I have to be an auteur. I'm a writer. I have to only read the good stuff. And I think there's value in all books. And actually was at the Renaissance Festival a week ago with my kids, and one of the authors of those old expanded universe novels was there. And I pulled my kids over. I was like, look, there's all these Star Wars novels. And they just thought it was so cool. And I remind myself too, why did you get into it in the first place, right? And for me, I mean, I was the kid who wore those VHS tapes out on Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. I went to bed watching those every night, and I devoured these books. And because I loved them and they were fun. Right. And like, I think sometimes you get lost in like, oh, I have to be like writing these perfect sentences. And I think that's important too. But I think at the heart of it, I want to entertain people. I want to tell interesting stories, and I want people to read them and consume them too. And that's why I'm doing it, is because I feel like there's stories within me that I want to get out to the public too. So yeah. And in terms of writers, I mean, more recently, I've been really enjoying Rob Hart. He wrote The Warehouse, and he wrote Paradox Hotel. I think he's great. He's a younger writer, and I really love M.K. Jemisin. She writes the Broken Earth trilogy. I just love that, and I love it because it's just, I like world building that seems effortless. I don't like when I get in, and that's why I like Dune so much too. I think he just like effortlessly will mention ornithopters, and you're like, oh, of course, ornithopters. But like, sometimes you read books and it's like 25 pages later, we're still talking about a mountain, and you lose me in that. So anyone who can make it seem effortless gets my stamp of approval, and I really respect that as in writers.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those, I mean, everybody likes, I mean, that's the thing, right? The elegance of it. And I would say like the best books, the books that even the ones that are held up in the canon that you would learn about through like, the academy, like going to school and grad school, the best ones have both of those elements where they have the kind of like pulpy page turning and also the beautiful sentences, the structure that you expect, especially in the 20th century, and even into the 19th century there. Dickens, I always bring up, like, he always did that. His stuff was entertaining. It was like a drive, like a page turning drive to the story. You want to know what happens, but then also incredibly eloquent, funny, like, the best ones have both. So yeah, I really appreciate that.
I agree. And I think of Steinbeck a lot. I mean, he was doing a lot of like cultural analysis, right? But I think there's just fun stories in there too. And Cannery Row was a book I read when I was going into Stanford. It was like one of those read this book before you come, and we're going to talk about it.
Right.
And I just it's an interesting analysis of like California at that time period, but it's also kind of a fun page turner, and eat beer milkshakes and just makes you laugh. And
Yeah.
and when I set out to write this book, in my mind, I said, all right, I'm going to write an elevated, well-written literary book that is a page turner. I mean, that's
Right.
what I wanted to do. I wanted to write an entertaining page turner that's elevated. So, and I think I did it. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Of
Congrats.
course.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. But yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, we love hearing that. We love hearing about writers and who inspires the writers that we have on here and stuff. And everybody has those answers. You can say Hemingway and Faulkner, and everybody loves it because they're great. They're great. You read those books, they're great. But then there's the sci-fi ones, the kind of obscure ones, or even the more contemporary ones. It's like, no, those all matter too. They all fill the creative mind.
Yeah, thanks Timothy Zahn for giving me Grand Admiral Thrawn. Right? I mean, I loved all that. And now it's kind of become ubiquitous with Disney and Star Wars, and you see so much of it. But when I was a kid, it was like I had the original trilogy and I had all these books. So they were fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to get into filmmaking too. So it's, yes, like, what got you into filmmaking? What drove you to that medium as a writer, artist, storyteller? Why filmmaking as opposed to, although you're doing the novel now, like what drove you to filmmaking first?
Well, my mind is just very visual. And I was realizing that when I was at Stanford, I would write things and people would be like, so what's going on here? And I'd be like, oh, you almost have to imagine it's like spinning. Like I had these ideas in my mind of like wanting to create this emotionality for people. And some of that was like visual storytelling. And I started to realize that, well, really that's camera, right? And that movement can be camera as well. And I think you can do that in a book too. But when you're like exploring and discovering, you want to convey certain feelings and moments to people certain ways. And you're always thinking about your audience and how do you get that across? So I think in this book too, there's a lot of big action sequences that I wrote that, I blocked them out. I know what the blocking would be if it was a movie. And I always think about where are people, how does it all work? And I think that helps you with what I mentioned earlier with M. Johnson's verisimilitude. Like, how do you create a reality that people will buy? And I think we've all read those things where you're like, wait, what's happening?
Right.
Where am I? And like, that's what I try to avoid. But yeah, and filmmaking's fun too, because it's very collaborative. Writing's a very lonely thing. And obviously when you write the screenplay, you do it by yourself, but then almost immediately it's like, okay, producers, what are we doing? How much money do we have? How are we going to make this? Is this possible? Whereas when you write a book, if you want to blow up a bridge, you blow up a bridge, right? But if you're making a movie and you have $1 million, you're probably not blowing that bridge up, right?
Yeah,
and some of that's gotten a little easier with computers, but that's expensive too. Like getting that VFX stuff to look even approachable. I always say to people, because they're like, oh, you can do anything. It's like, well, yeah, but once you put it out there, you can't put on the screen, hey, we only had this much money and this person was sick today. And sorry, I know it looks pretty good, but it's not Marvel quality. You can't do that, right? It's like, and people don't watch your movies and say, well, they only had $500,000. They watch it and they expect what they've watched already. So that shouldn't be a detractor for you doing it, but you have to be smart in what you're trying to accomplish and what's realistic, and then try to push those boundaries and do something that can be a calling card for you as well. And with What So Remains, that was one of the main reasons I wrote it outside, because I just knew, okay, well, we're going to go out there and I'm just going to get free production design. It's going to be beautiful. We got all these forests around LA, and we got out there and there had actually been a forest fire a couple of years before. So we got all this great, it's sad that there was a forest fire, but we got all this beautiful charred trees, and it looks like we planned that, right? I wrote that in the script, but we didn't, how are we going to do that? Oh, we'll just find something, it'll be okay. And then we get there and it's like, well, this visual speaks to the emotionality that's in the story, and it's so cool. And sometimes those happy accidents can be the magic in movies too, and being open and finding things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is, we had another kind of film. He was always indie. We directed indie horror movies for a while, and then went into writing and publishing poetry and fiction. And that's what he said too, where he just said the freedom in writing the novel. You don't have to worry about the budget. You can blow up the helicopter in the novel, but you can't do it when you're doing an indie, horror movie for $12,000 or whatever,
Yeah.
It just opens you up to that. But so it is interesting because there are so many different forms you could choose as an artist, as a creative. And, yeah, you already mentioned starting off when you're younger, going into reading and writing stuff, be like, oh, I think I want to be a writer, going to college. And then you kind of getting serious about this other visual art form, film.
Most definitely.
And it just, the differences, I mean, we're going to keep talking about the differences because one, that's a theme on the podcast, kind of like the different, how you approach it and all that, but also just because it fascinates me, and I think,
well, I love talking about it too. So
yeah. And
I'm here for it.
Are you millennial?
I think I am a millennial. I think I'm one of the earliest millennials.
Elder
I'm like
millennial,
early
yeah.
80s. I think I've made it by a couple years, but so I'm that. I remember the Gen X, the analog, and then we got internet and we got computers. So I'm that age of person. Right?
Yeah. The only reason I ask is just because it's a theme on this podcast because I'm a millennial, so I'm always kind of, and millennials, we always got a bad rap in the media and stuff like that until Gen Z surpassed us for the complaint department with people making culture articles complaining. But I think there's a very unique, because you already mentioned growing up in the analog and then moving to digital, like that. We were the generation that did that, and I think especially with film, like we were not the first generation, because Gen X has some overlap with this, but we basically were like the one where we didn't have to go to revival theaters to see old movies. We didn't have to, we could go to Blockbuster. We could buy the DVD. We could buy the VHS before the DVD, and it was just, there was all this film there for like a young millennial to like fall in love with, and like you said, wearing out the VHS tapes, like when from watching them so much. There was just all this stuff that you could just pull creatively from and get inspired by, especially Are you a big Star Wars guy? You already mentioned, yeah.
I'm a big Star Wars guy. I mean, I'm a big Star Trek guy. I love Twilight Zone, which was a big influence in this book, just like the alternate reality, like the old black and white. And that's the other thing when we were kids growing up, late 80s, early 90s. I mean, you had Nick at Night. You got to watch a lot of stuff from the 60s and 70s. Alfred Hitchcock Presents. I mean, that's not our time period, but it was on TV a lot. Whereas now, with streaming, if I want my kids to watch that, I have to go find it, right? Yeah. But like we would just sit down on TV and say, what's on, right? And you'd flip channels and you'd be like, who's this bald man? And you're like 8 years old and you're like, it's Alfred Hitchcock. It's like, well, who's Alfred Hitchcock? And now, obviously, being a film guy, I love Alfred Hitchcock. But like, like when you're younger, you don't really realize. And I think that was kind of a beautiful time period where you could discover a lot of things. And I also think we didn't realize at the time, but we were really living through like a heyday of movies in the 80s. I mean, obviously a lot of those movies would not get made now, right? And like the crossover they used to do with cartoons, books, they don't do that as much anymore. I mean, they're starting to do it now with like Disney's doing a lot of that, but back then it was everything. I mean, you had Ghostbusters cartoons and Ghostbusters movies, and and I think that we didn't really realize it, but we were lucky to be in that time period too. And also just being able in the 90s to show up in a movie theater and there were a lot of movies playing, right? And like they weren't all tentpoles, and some of them were. I always bring up Reign of Fire. I love that movie, and it's got Matthew McConaughey in it. It's got A-list actors, and it was a B movie, right? It was like a low budget. I mean, it was an expensive movie, but it was not the biggest budget movies they were making at the time. And I remember seeing that in the theater, and you just went and saw things.
Yeah.
That's one thing I do miss. I mean, you can obviously still go to movie theaters. I just feel like there's not as many options, not as many just like, oh, what's playing? Let's go see. It's like you have to like, it's almost like they're all events right now, whereas back then it wasn't like that necessarily.
The consolidation, the consolidation of the artistic kind of industries is really, and even that, like you mentioned, like I remember turning on the Sci-Fi channel would have that that New Year's Eve marathon of the Twilight Zone every year. I remember watching it religiously. And you turn on TBS, like the Superstation, and Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window would just be on, and you would just catch it. You'd be like a 10-year-old kid, and you'd be drawn into this, and you'd be like, now you have to seek it out. And I've already talked about this on the podcast many times. With a lot of these streamers, they get pretty stingy with what's streaming every month. Like they're kind of like, oh, you want that one? Well, we're going to give you the sequel, and then the prequel. But we're not going to give you the original. You have to rent that or wait till next month.
And as a filmmaker too, I mean, you kind of live it the other way. I mean, a lot of that is licensing issues. So I mean, like my movie was on Netflix for like a year because that's how they paid us money. It played for a year, and that was awesome. Obviously, it was there. Now it's out there. And now that was on Paramount Plus, and they paid us less money, but still a decent chunk, and it was there. Now it's gone. And,
Right.
it's still on Apple. I always call it iTunes, Apple TV. It's on Prime. It's on Tubi. But I always have to look. I'm like, people
Right.
be like, where can I watch it? I'm like, I'm not sure. I know you can still buy DVDs on Amazon, but like streaming wise, it's always moving. But it's out there still. But it's always a moving target. So I mean, it boggles my mind though. Sometimes it's like I'm paying for all these different services, and I still can't find movies. Sometimes they're just like on none of them.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I noticed that especially around Christmas time, I was looking for some Christmas classics, and I just had my first kid a few months ago, and I was like, oh, let's show her some of these
Congrats.
Christmas. Oh, thank you. Yeah. And I was like, these kids are so stingy. I'm like, what is this? I've never even heard of this Christmas movie. Like, where's Rudolph? Like, who's keeping this in the vault? But you brought up something I wanted to ask you about it. We're jumping around, but that's, whatever. That's podcasting. Yeah. Negotiating with Netflix, like, selling, licensing, whatever, getting distribution through Netflix, all these different streamers, it's everybody's young filmmakers, young artists. They're dreaming about that. What was that like? Well, I've heard some stories about what it is to negotiate with like some of these streamers, but I don't know, but just like, how was that experience getting, your baby out there, having them, distribute it for you and all that? How did that go?
So I mean, there's a difference too between like you pitch Netflix and they say, okay, we want to make this, and you're a Netflix movie, versus you make something and then you approach these companies and say, hey, would you put it on? And I think the main key too as a filmmaker, I mean, some people are good at all of it, but finding good distribution outlets, finding a good distribution company that can help you get it out there. And we found Gravitas, and they really took our movie and ran with it, and it's been great. But I think too, a lot of times people be like, oh, don't do the festivals, it's just it's for ego.
Right.
And I didn't do as many with the movie because I was like, let's just get it out there, I'm on to the next thing. And I think one thing I learned is, as I get older, so much of it is networking, right? It's like any business. It's like, who do you know? Who have you met? And festivals are just another way to meet people. I think it's true of writing too. I'm planning to go to a bunch of conventions this year because you're just trying to meet other people, and you never know. I mean, sometimes it's just like, oh, I met this really famous person, they're not going to help me, or I met this person who's not even where I'm at, and they want me to help them, and can I actually help them? I don't know. But it's just like a network of people, and you never know who's going to become your fan. I mean, I mentioned those authors earlier. I've never met any of them. I just gave them a big promo, and you never know who's going to be that fan for you and who's going to maybe introduce you to someone else. And I don't think you can go into things, at least I just try to be honest and forthright. I don't go into these relationships with like, what are you going to do for me?
Right.
But I think you have to just put yourself out there, though, is the key. Because if you don't create and you're not putting yourself out there, no one cares. Even if you got the one good thing, inevitably too, even if that gets made, they're like, well, what's next? What else do you have? And if you have nothing, you're like, give me 6 months. And you can't give them. So, you need to always be creating, always be writing. I mean, I've got so many scripts that are just like sitting there. They're on people's shelves, and this company reads and they love it, and let us know in the next one. And when the movie came out, I was like, well, love the movie. Let us know when you're more famous. They don't say it like that, but like that's what they're saying to you, right? So you just have to always be moving forward and chasing it. And you can't compare yourself to other people. I've had people have a lot of success in my circles, and it falls off. And I have people starting to have more success now. You just never know, right? And you just have to keep chasing it too, and finding ways to get your writing or your filmmaking out there. And if you're doing it because you think I'm going to be, like you said earlier, I'm going to make $1 million right out of the gate and maybe directing the next Star Wars movie, probably will be, there's probably one of you out there listening right now, but you probably will be disappointed, right? But you have to do it because you love it, and hopefully that success comes later too. And if anyone from Disney's listening, I'm available. You can call me. I'd love to direct the next Star Wars movie.
Absolutely, yeah.
Although with the fandom these days, maybe I don't want that.
Yeah, that's true. Although if you're a big fan, it would turn out all right. You do right by the fan base probably, because you're of the fan base. But that's something I wanted to ask you about too, because we have a lot of people that are aspiring writers, aspiring creatives, and stuff that listen to this, and we like to ask these kind of questions. What was it like for you to break into this type of industry? Because I mean, the film industry, publishing's hard enough, and I know everybody listening knows that. Film industry, it's a whole different animal. I mean, 'cause
Yeah.
everybody wants it, of course. Not everybody can get it. You said yourself, yeah, we would have took you like a decade to keep going
Yeah.
until you got your directorial debut for feature length, at least. You had short films. But what was that like? What was that grind like? We want to know about the grind. I think as much detail as you want to give in terms of like,
The grind is real. I mean, I can't tell you how many you meet with all these people, and some of them are legit, and some of them you're like, I'm like in a back alley, I'm exaggerating, but it's like, we'll pop the trunk. Oh, you want to make a movie? No, I mean, but it is. There's all sorts of people out there, and some of them are making stuff, and some of them aren't, and some of them are just trying to see if you can get some money to it. They can leech on to you, and some of them are trying to help you. So, I mean, you just have to meet a lot of people. I mean, I made that movie. Obviously, it came out in 2018. Had another one lined up. Was negotiating with this company. They were gonna back me. They had financing. I think it was out of the Middle East, somewhere like Israel, and pandemic starts.
right.
And it's like, okay, still like the script. Let's take a step back. We'll note this thing. We'll really go through make this perfect. And then once we figure out how we're going to make these things with the pandemic, we'll make it. Well, long story short, I mean, we noted that thing to death. And by the time it was like, all right, we're ready, the money had gone away. And it was like, well, we're not going to make this anymore, but let's know on the next one. And it's like, I can't even use that because it's like been used. It's been through so many rounds of notes. It's like probably not good anymore. And certainly not what I would have written originally. And then you're on to the next thing. And then obviously there was a strike, and now we're kind of getting it going again. And, not a lot of stuff is being made right now.
Right.
I mean, it seems like it's starting to come back, but I was talking to my manager the other day, and I'm out to some places, and it's like, well, what they think? And it's just trying to grind through someone to say yes. And even when they say yes, I mean, it's not real until you're on set rolling, honestly. And because I've had some yeses, and they're not real, right? Like
Right.
No one can watch those.
Yeah.
No one's ever heard of these scripts I've written for people. You might make a little money, but who cares? But
Right.
it's not enough to like really justify it. So, I mean, again, it just has to be a passion, and you just have to keep chasing it. And I think you have to, when you do get those shots, you can't be like so focused on, it's hard because you get lost in it. You're like, all right, I got to make this good. But you have to think like, well, what is going to make this unique? What's going to make it stand out? And what's going to be my calling card for some of this stuff too. And I think that's important for young filmmakers, because I think we always think, especially when we're younger, well, there's going to be one more and I'll do that on the next one. And there may not be a next one. So you just have to keep going too. I mean, and I will be making another movie one of these days. I don't know when, but you just keep chasing it and trying to do it.
Yeah, that's interesting too. No, please go on.
I was just going to say, and hopefully the book does well. And maybe, like I said, maybe that's another door in. I don't know. Like, I honestly don't know. And I've been doing it for a while, but you never know what's going to speak to people and what's going to connect with people and what's going to get you that opportunity either.
Yeah. That's what, I mean, we're just fascinated with that too, because the having mostly an audience of creatives here that like are writers mostly, but it's to see the aftermath of the streaming, the quote unquote streaming wars, right? Where it was kind of like this, all these companies were just desperate to get people to subscribe to the streaming platforms, and they were just burning through cash, right? For a few years there, just spending whatever it took to get, a movie made or getting Scorsese on like Netflix or something, they give him whatever he wanted. And now they're kind of all being like, tightening the belt, because it's like, well, that didn't work out. We didn't get a lot of financial return. So now everybody's suffering for it, at least, the creatives in the industry. But that's so, I mean, and you see this across every medium. You're seeing it across TV. You're seeing it across publishing. You're seeing it. I'm not as familiar with, visual arts and stuff, but I'm sure it's happening there as well. Kind of like the opportunities are drying up. So yeah, I mean, it makes even more sense to take advantage of whatever one you get the best you can for that.
Yeah. And now obviously technology is always a disruptor too. And with AI and people trying to make stuff with AI to save money, I think we have to push back against that and I honestly think one day we'll be like, well, I buy things because it's made by a person, right? Like people get back to vinyl. But I mean, I think there's value in our work as people. And I don't think we should let people copy the greats and give us carbon copies of things. I think we need to keep creating and struggle too, because I mean, obviously we see it. There's a lot of reboots, a lot of remakes,
Right.
because that's easy, right? We know it's a built-in audience. I know they know if they make Ghostbusters 47, there's X number of people who are going to see it no matter what, right? And I think there's a lot. I mean, I've read the scripts. There's a lot of great writers out there and a lot of great stories that need to get made and told for a next generation, and you can remake those in 20 years, right? But like, if we're just locked in the constant remake world, we're never. Then we complain, oh, I've seen all these things. Why don't they make anything new? Well, they're out. People are out there, and I think we heard that last year at the Academy Awards when he won Best Screenplay. He was talking about like, hey, someone gave me a shot. There's a lot of people out there who need a shot. Like, let's give people shots. So, you know, I think you have to. Again, it's a little luck, but you got to be ready when the luck knocks, right? Like when someone knocks on your door and says, hey, let's do this, you got to be ready to go too.
Yeah, and I didn't plan on asking you this, but I was thinking about the AI. Everybody's talking about it. It's constantly something. That was the big part of the strike that just ended over there in Hollywood, for listeners that don't know. It's you know, my day job is I train AI for a living, essentially, because that's what you're stuck doing if you have an art degree, and you know you're trying to make these projects, but then you know you need a day job. And my experience with it is always just, you know, it's so overhyped. Like, it is so primitive right now. Like, they're like, oh, it's going to revolutionize the film industry. I'm like, yeah, eventually, maybe 40 years from now, 30 years from now, but it can barely recreate like a shot like right now. Like, it's like a little infant. It's a baby. You need to like this thing's going to take 25 years. Like, and then you have people, you know, these tech people standing up being like, oh, it's going to revolutionize treating disease. I'm like, yeah, eventually, maybe 50 years from now. But like, it can't right now, dude. And they're like, oh, in 10 years. I'm like, no, it's not even close, man. Like, you should see, I see what it spits out with these prompts. Like, it is and then, you know, these are major companies that I contract with in my company to do it, and I'm just thinking like, okay, these are the best on the market, these are the best AI models on the market, and they can barely do this. Like, everyone's like, oh, ChatGPT, it can write pretty good, it can give you a B paper for about 500 words, and then it starts forgetting what it wrote because it's a fucking machine. Because it's a machine. It's primitive,
and someone has to tell it what to do too. So I mean, obviously I think there's a world where we can use these tools for the betterment of people. But I mean, I want it to take away the things I don't want to do, right? Like we don't want to do our laundry. We don't want to do our dishes. We don't want to pay our taxes. We want something to help us with those things. We don't want it to create art, play sports for us, and do the fun stuff. Like, the fun stuff should be for people. And I think at the end of the day, we as consumers have to tell them what we want too. Like, those guys are just trying to make money. And gals, like, I mean, they're in it to make money. That's the bottom line. I don't think many of them are trying to fix the world. Some of them are, but I think a lot of them are like, well, maybe we'll fix the world, but we're going to be rich when we do it too. And it has to be a world we want to live in, and we have to make sure we're creating something we want to be a part of. And if it's just, how do I make the next big cool thing to splash into Silicon Valley and get hedge fund money, I mean, I think we're going to get to the end of it and say, what is half of this stuff? And I think we're already seeing that a little bit with social media, and it's a necessary evil to promote yourself, and you get on these things. But it's like, you know, the algorithm spits the same darn videos at you, like, in different ways. And it's like, oh, this is popular right now when this actor's dancing in front of anything. So you see 400,000 of those videos. It's like, what happened to seeing my friends on vacation, right? Like, you know, and it's not what we really signed up for. So I think it's it's a moving target, but I think we have agency and control over what it becomes. And I think we can push back too. If we don't want the Hemingway ripoff novel written by a computer, we want the Hemingway ripoff novel written by a human being. We can have that, right? So it's just, I think it's all fluid, and every generation has something that scares them. And you talked about ripping on Gen Z. I mean, I'm a big history buff. I mean, you go back and read like Cato from the Roman times. He's like, these young guys, they're like not cutting their beards the right way and long hair. And where's philosophy going? We're all going to die. And 2,000 years later, we're upset about how kids are cutting their hair and what they're creating on computers, right? It's all the same.
Right. Yeah.
And like human beings are the same. And I think that's why it's important we study and read and learn about ourselves too. And if we're just watching 10-second videos on Instagram, we're not really moving the dial forward, right?
Yeah, that's interesting too. And the kind of the point of because everything goes through social media now. Like social media is at least the marketing world in its entirety right now.
Mm-hmm.
And like they confuse memes. So like people use AI to make like a funny meme of somebody dancing over some, whatever green screen image or something. And they're like, oh, that's the same thing as filmmaking. And like, no, it isn't. Like it's a different thing. But like, yeah, that's it. I mean, social media
I
too.
see a lot of those like, hey, look, it's Star Wars from the 70s, or it's
right.
What if the Soviet Union made Lord of the Rings? And yeah, those are funny for a minute, but like
that's all
I don't need 400,000 of them either, and I don't need to watch a movie of that. Like I want to watch a movie of something creative that I haven't thought of and I haven't seen. I want a human being out there who's sitting out there right now to impress me and surprise me, right? And do something that I haven't thought of or haven't imagined.
Yeah,
that's the point of it.
And it's
not
like
to feed
no, please.
I was just going to say, not to feed a algorithm what's been done and get different versions of it.
Yes, 100% too. Yeah. Like you said, it's good for 2 seconds when you're scrolling. And even social media, it's again another theme because it's just such a part of being a creative now. Where
it really is.
That's the last couple of years, that's completely changed. It's all pay to play. There's no organic growth. They know how valuable it is. Like you're just a person on there, posting selfies. Well, you can't grow your account like you used to even 4 or 5 years ago. It's like, no, they want you to pay for the promo. It's like, because they know how valuable it is now. Like you can be made a celebrity off of this if you do it well enough, But getting it back to I know, like, again, we go all over the place, but it's fun. But this brings us to fiction. Why fiction? Why get into writing fiction and take time away from making movies? What drove you to get this story out in the novel form instead of the film, or on the screen, so to speak? Because again, not that they're great business models, either of them, right? But fiction's especially a bad business model compared to making movies and stuff. But again, I don't know. Maybe it's not. Maybe there's a better business model than making movies. But why go into fiction? If you're hearing this, it's because you are listening to the free public feed of Heavy Board. To get complete, uncensored, uninterrupted, full access to this podcast, become a subscriber at patreon.com/heavyboard. That's right, Heavy Board is made possible by subscribers like you. For less than 1 cup of coffee per month, you will receive private access to uncensored, full-length episodes, Jerk Shop, heavy bonus content, subscribers-only AMA episodes, bonus extended interviews, and more. Come join the conversation today at patreon.com/heavyboard. At this point, yeah. Why take the turn?
Honestly, just because the kid in me wants to have a book on shelves and wants to tell this story. And like I said earlier, I just knew if I wrote the script, no one was ever going to hear about it.
Right.
It was going to be a calling card, and maybe it would have gotten me a movie, or maybe it wouldn't have. Who knows? But I think now it's cool intellectual property, and who knows what happens in 5 or 10 years? And maybe someone finds it, and there's a couple. I'm writing another one right now, and I can keep writing scripts too, and they're kind of, and I do. So they're not mutually exclusive, right? So I can do both, and I can chase it all. So that's kind of my mindset too, and I can do both. So I'm going to do them, and I think there's value in both mediums too, and as an artist.
Yeah, and this is something that we always ask on the show. It's a theme, really, kind of like, screenwriting, and you just mentioned it, screenwriting versus novel writing. Is there a difference? What is the difference? Do you approach each of them differently? Your ideas on this. Yeah, well, I mean, there's the obvious. A script is much shorter than a book, right? A script's probably 15 to 20,000 words. A book's on the short, a 300-page book's about 80,000 words. And if you're a Robert Jordan fan, they're 180,000 words. But right, yeah.
Us mere mortals write about 80,000 words for a book, and that's what people want to read too, because you can barely get them to read anything.
Yeah.
So, I mean, a script is very sparse. It's very utilitarian, right? I mean, like you have to describe things quickly and you have to paint a picture. That doesn't mean don't describe things, but you
Right.
can't write 3 pages of description.
Right.
People are going to put it down. I mean, it has to be snappy. It has to go. So I think when you switch over to a book, you're like, oh, I have so much more room now. I can do whatever I want. And I think that's a trap, though, because then you're just writing that 200,000 word novel that no one wants to read. And some people, they do want to read them, right? I mean,
Right.
Sanderson writes these very long novels, and he's very wealthy. So who am I to criticize him? But I think for me, screenwriting allowed me to push the novel back down in size, right? So it's
Right.
like I always think about a scene of like, what's my in, what's my out, and what are my characters doing? Why are they growing? Why are we doing this? And if you can't answer those questions, it probably shouldn't be in the screenplay, and it certainly shouldn't be in the book. So it's always about character first. It has to be driven by character, and then I like plot and story. So
Right.
I think every moment should be driving the story forward. And if you're stuck in neutral, hanging out because you're developing character, you should find things for them to do. And I think that's very true in screenwriting. It's show, don't tell, right? If you're writing about how someone has empathy, no one's going to see that on the movie. Like all your description is instructions of what to film. So if you're writing instructions of emotionality and things, I mean, maybe the actor can do it, maybe they can't. So maybe you should give the actor something to do that shows that he really cares about people. Well,
Right.
this is the bad idea, but it's a famous book, right? Have him save a cat, right?
Yeah.
And then we see, wow, this guy's he really cares, and he helped that old lady. And like you get that character in a very quick beat versus 4 or 5 pages of description. So I tried to take that into the novel too. Is like, what are the actions that show what he's doing? And then obviously with a novel, you get to get into someone's psyche a little more. And that's the fun of it too, is you do get more of the backstory and why are they doing these things? Why did they make that decision? Maybe your character doesn't know, and you get to go on that exploration. Whereas in a movie, you really have to think about it as a visual medium and how are we going to show that? What are my cutaways? What's my insert that shows this moment? What's my MacGuffin that's important to this story that drives it forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's well, it's interesting to me, and I think our listeners too, just because there is overlap, but then there's these distinct formulaic kind of differences. And people will say formulaic because it's a bad thing, and it can be a bad thing, but it's also like that's the structure of story. Like I always say, like I love procedurals, like I like procedural TV shows, NCIS, SVU kind of, and even the better ones than that, those are like, but I always say there's something comforting in them, but it's also just like, that's what creates the suspense is like, this is a rule system that if you follow, and you can break rules and it can be fun, but most of the time when you break them, it ends up spoiling the story or like the feeling that you're trying to invoke in an audience or a reader. And and everybody brings up the big famous directors that take no bullshit, like Tarantino or something, where he's like, oh, I wrote 10 pages of like prose description because Brad needed to know it, and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And it's like, yeah, he can do that because he's top 1% of in the industry here. He can do that, but most of us, it's gonna get thrown out. Like it's like, no, you're not gonna get away with that. So it's just
I remember doing stuff. I've been in a screenwriting class where it's like, okay, well, this is like it's a thriller. I'm going to be really sparse in my language. And I remember sitting there and they were like, so what's happening here? And I was like, oh, well, I'm just doing this sparse thing because it's sparse. And they're like, oh, yeah, but
what's happening? But what's happening?
Yeah, I do, don't I? So you can try things and fail at them.
Right.
Too, and I think that's a good learning curve. But I always say, too, I mean, I remember being a young writer and being like, I'm not going to read that book on writing. I'm going to learn I'm going to like find my path and be a writer. I think you have to learn the rules so you can break them. If you don't know how to do a 3-act structure and you don't know what a midpoint is, you don't know what a point of attack is, and you don't know these different storytelling techniques, how can you possibly tell a good story? I mean, you can't structure it because there's only so many structures, and then you can play with it once you've kind of built it out. And that's true of a book too. I think people forget. I mean, a book has a structure too. It's just a longer structure.
Yeah.
And plays have structures, 5-act structures, and you can mess with them as long as you know what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing and you're messing with them, it's just because you're making a bad story, probably.
Right.
So I think it's important to learn these techniques and then write the bad stories. And I've written plenty of them. And it's a journey of getting better too, and listening to other people. And not necessarily, I think the author's goal in taking notes is not to necessarily be an order taker. Oh, you didn't like that? I'll do exactly what you said and change it. It's to say, okay, they're bored in chapter 10. They don't like my main character because he did XYZ. So like, I want them to like him. How do I fix that? Right? Like, what are my solutions to that problem? Because it's obviously a problem. And you have to get a few opinions because some people will not agree. And then you have to analyze, like, is that a valid criticism or is it just that one person? Because when you release these things, you will get a lot of criticism.
Yes.
And if you didn't want that criticism that one person told you to be a thing, and then you release it and everyone says it, you're going to feel bad. You're going to be annoyed. And so the time to fix it is before. So that's why it's important to get, like I talked about earlier, the people you trust, the other creatives who can read your stuff and give you honest feedback. And then you as the author can be mad for a day, and then you got to get back to work and fix it.
Yeah, absolutely. And this brings me to kind of the detective fiction, you know, I'll use the word formula, but it is kind of like what your expectations when you say, oh, there's a detective and you're doing kind of a procedural finding clues, there's an expectation in the reader, in the viewer, the audience, you're kind of, but I would ask, so it's in the book, detective fiction, there's homage to kind of the classic detective story. And we love that here on this podcast, but just kind of what drew you in about the kind of detective fiction and why you chose to kind of go that way with the novel?
Yeah. I love the devil may care aspect of it. And I also just love, they're heroes and they're anti-heroes, right? And I wanted to really walk that fine line of like, is Dustin Raines a good guy or a bad guy? Right. Are we rooting for him or are we not? And I pushed that in both ways. And I got I let people read it, and sometimes people are like, I don't know, I don't really like the guy, and you pull it back. And for me, they're very flawed characters, and it's just the genre I love to read, and I love the movies from the 40s and 50s. And I thought it would be fun to kind of make a modern version of that and play with those tropes and then break them, right? Yeah. So it's like we already spoke about. I know all the rules of I'm a cinephile, I'm a avid reader, I know them all, right? So it's like some people start reading, it's like, oh, it's like a detective thing, and it's like kind of like formulaic, and I just did air quotes, but that it's purposeful in driving it to somewhere else too, and then you break the rule, and that's where it gets interesting. And what can you do to do something different with the formula?
Yeah. I always say like that too, and I want to ask you about this, where kind of like when I'm watching a detective thing or reading a detective thing, there's that expectation of like, and I think the biggest mistake I see in ones that don't work or fail is like, you have to let the viewer, especially in filmmaking, let the viewer discover it with the detective, like kind of, you can't just say it in dialogue and then expect everybody to have that feeling like they're like watching like a great story. And it's like that's part of the rules. And like, if you're not paying attention to it, like it hurts your final artistic product kind of. So I'm just always fascinated. We love this. I love kind of pulpy stuff too. And again, who are some of your favorites in terms of like the great kind of, detective writers, especially from that era kind of, I love Ross McDonald personally. He's probably my favorite. Yeah. Zebra Striped Hearse. But who are your favorites?
Hammond books, Lady in the Lake. The Big Sleep. They're all, and it's fun too, because I like that first person in the weeds with them aspect of it. And that was fun for me with this book. And you spoke to it too, because this is a genre mashup, right? So it starts out as the gritty LA detective, and without giving too much away, it spirals into a big space opera science fiction novel. But he doesn't know he's in a big science fiction world. He doesn't know this other universe exists. So I thought that was a fun way through the detective to have the reader discover with him this other world, and he doesn't believe it. Do we believe it? Do we trust him? Is he a reliable narrator? I thought all that would be fun to play with. And I think it lends itself to the genre mashup aspect and the uniqueness of the story. Is I don't think you can trust him from the get-go, and then it kind of grows from there, and we go on the journey with him and find the clues and discover the mystery, and then we get to go on the adventure with him too. And that was all things that I just thought I would love to read it, and I had fun writing it too.
Yeah, that's one of the questions I wanted to ask you with, because I think there's two types of fans for like this kind of mystery or detective kind of stuff, that big adventure. Are you a fan of the chase or the resolution? You know, which one is better for you? Not that you have to choose, but just we're making you for this podcast. Yeah, are you?
Yeah, I like the chase. I think. I mean, I think the chase has to have a good resolution though. So you can't have one without the other.
Right.
You're never going to have a good resolution if there's nothing happening, right?
That disappointment.
There's no problem. And then there needs to be. I like the adventure though. I like the page turner. I like the second act that has a lot of fun in it and has the explosions and the bridge. I want the bridge to blow up. So that's just my personal preference. So I definitely fit a bunch of that in this.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm the same way. I'm a chase guy as well. The chase is more important than the resolution. Although, yeah, if the resolution's bad, it makes the entire chase feel less good and less important.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all had that experience where you get to the end, and you're like, that's it? Okay. Right. I thought it was something else, and that sort of seems not, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not cathartic. It doesn't make you feel right. And I think that's the struggle with any story, is like, how does it end? I mean, that's hard. Endings are very hard. And I think there's some very famous filmmakers who aren't great at endings, right? They're great at putting things up. And I like their movies still, but you know going in, you're probably not going to like the outcome, but maybe the journey is worth it.
Yeah, that's always interesting too. And when I hear people say that, like, you know, just all over the place, people in film forums, whatever, or social media, where I'm just like, they're like, oh, I didn't like the ending, or I plot doesn't matter. I'm like, no, you understand why you feel unsatisfied at the end of this? It's because of the plot. There was a weakness in the plot at some point, and it led you to, at the end of the hour and a half, 2 hours, to be, like, kind of like you just feel that deflation happen.
And I think that's pacing, right? Or going back and making, because writing is, you have a good idea like halfway through or near the end, and then you have to go back and make it seem like you had the plan all along, because you plan and then you write and different things happen, and you have to adapt and go with the story and where your characters take you to, and then you have to go back and leave those breadcrumbs and make people feel like they're figuring it out with the character and with the author. And if you don't do that and you just have like a cool ending, it's going to feel like it came out of left field. And it's like, well, that's when people complain, right? Oh, well, they just fixed it. And like, who cares? Like, like anyone can do that. But if it feels like a natural progression and you eventually get to the inevitability, it had to end that way. That's when you have a good story.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. The reason I was thinking about this so much is, you know, I just rewatched all the Indiana Jones movies.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, as we got to that final one, the most recent one, I was like, why does this feel so different? And then I noticed during that one point where they're on the boat and the girl is explaining the little dial to everybody. And I was just like, she's just lecturing us. Like we're not letting us discover why this is important, why it's cool, neat. She's just like giving a lesson, lecturing everybody standing around. And I'm just kind of like, that's it, right? Like that's why it feels not just because, you know, Harrison Ford's 80 years old and it's because it feels a little different structurally, as opposed, especially if you go back to kind of The Last Crusade, where that is so ingrained into kind of the clue finding. You find it as
that's
Harrison
a big
Ford.
mystery.
Yeah, just fantastic. All right, yeah. So we're good to writing stuff. These are writing questions that we like to ask everybody that comes on here. What is your writing routine like? How do you like to do it?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I'll write. I'm sitting in my office right now, so I often write at my desk. But I wrote a lot of this book in LA at coffee shops and little writing. I was a part of a writing enclave that doesn't exist anymore, but it was cool. Like converted house, I would go if I needed it to be quiet. But I'm not I don't need 12 hours a day. Like like the other day I wrote like 1,500 words. I did in like 90 minutes, 2 hours. And I know I'm going to go back and fix that. And to me, it's like, get the words out. And I like to be efficient, and you have to shut off the phone and unless you're going to look something up. You can't be on, like we talked about, you can't be scrolling on social media. You have to let yourself be bored a little bit and let your mind wander. And that's when sometimes you'll find the things you didn't plan. I do a little bit of outlining. I definitely outline in my brain a lot. If you read
Right.
my notes, it wouldn't make sense to you. You probably couldn't write a book with it. They make sense to me, but I'm not a big. I wrote this 95-page outline, and now I'm just like
Right.
inserting things. Like I don't do that, and I know people do that, and they're very successful with it. But that's never been
Sure.
me. I'm more of a, I guess we call it a pantser, but I do have a plan. So I'm like, I guess I'm a hybrid. And like I said, I like to set goals. So it's like, well, if I could write at least 500 words 4 times a week, that I'll have a book in 40 weeks. I'd like to do it quicker than that. But if you set goals, it
Right.
actually gets done and you actually accomplish it. So that's how I approach it.
Are you
And
a
yeah,
daily writer, or every other day whenever you find the time? You just kind of like you said, you
no,
just need like
I'm
an hour or
probably,
two, and you can sit down and get
I'm,
something done. Or
yeah, I mean, I'm at least 5 times a week. Sometimes
right,
I take a couple of days off, and sometimes if it's just burning to get out of you and you can't stop thinking about it, you just got to do it. And sometimes you need to step back and be like, all right, I'm going to let this simmer. And all of a sudden you'll have an idea and you got to get back to it. But I definitely think more days than not, and just try, because I think it's so much easier to go back and fix your bad pages than to create them.
right,
When you stare at the blank page, that's the hard part. So get the hard part out of the way and worry about it later. Go back and fix it later. Like I know the thing I finished the other day, it's like close, but it's probably like 80% there. I mean,
right.
I know some of that. I'm like, some of the descriptions are just like the thing, and I'll go back and make it good later. But if you just sit there like, how am I going to describe this building, and you spend 4 hours thinking about a column, I mean, that's probably like 10 words, and you've wasted so much time. So to me, I like to have something that feels like it's going to be completed. And sometimes I've had this with scripts too, where you get in the middle, you have to have a little bit of a plan, because I've definitely gotten into some things and I get to the middle, I'm like, ah, man, I knew I didn't have a third act, and here I am.
Right.
Like we're at the midpoint, and the third act looms, and I don't know what to have them do. So you do have to have a plan of like where you're going to lead, but you can't be so married to it that if you have a better idea along the way, that you're not going to like blow it up and change it. And that's why I always say, like, well, don't like spend forever rewriting the first 15 pages of your screenplay. They may not even be in the darn thing when you get done. I
Right.
think you just have to get to the end sometimes, and then go back and say, well, is all this working? Did I have a better idea? How do I tweak it and change it? And obviously, that's a little more daunting with a novel, because it's just such a big thing. So if you can't, I can keep it all straight in my head. If you're not one of those people, you can take better notes and keep track of it. And when you start to change something, maybe sit down and say, okay, well, I need to fix this on page 47, or I know it's somewhere at the beginning. This guy says this thing, and that can't happen anymore. And remind yourself so it doesn't surprise you later when you're in editing and some things don't make sense, right? But
Yeah.
there's always things you'll find too.
Yeah, I like that you do a combination of it too, with kind of the more structured outlining, and then also kind of going with whatever the creative impulse pulls. But I mean, is that's something I'm thinking of now too, in terms of like script writing versus novel writing. Obviously, screenwriting is much more focused on the structure and formatting of it than the novel. Where outlining, like if you're not outlining your screenplays to a certain point, just basic notes, it's going to be a
Mm-hmm.
slog. I mean, it's going to be a long, long, long process, and you're probably going to make a lot of more mistakes than if you gave yourself a little bit of structure, just a little bit. Like you said, don't have to be
Yeah.
married to it, just a little bit of structure, and then you can go
Well,
all these
think of
different
them as,
directions.
I forget what, there's a screenwriting book, but you think of them like signposts or like nails to, like, you're tying string between beats, right? And
Right.
like I know I need to get here. There's probably like 10 minutes of 10 pages of something that needs to happen, but you're going to that moment. You get to that moment, and you know you're going to this next moment. And you know that that leads to this midpoint, this rising action. So if you have those general brush strokes, then when you go and start filling in the blanks, it will make more sense to you to get there, and it will give your reader things to like hang their hat on too. And if you're just writing and writing and writing, and that's when you get the thought soup that won't make sense to anyone but you, and you have to avoid that too. But if you're gonna have the thought soup, you just need to know you got to fix it before you let other people read it too.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Any rituals or anything that you do to get going on writing, or just kind of force?
Too much iced coffee,
Yeah, yeah,
and sometimes you're just sitting there and you do everything but the writing and just kicking yourself in the butt a little bit. And it's like, go sit down. And, like I said, a couple hundred words is doable. And once
right.
you get going, all of a sudden it becomes more. So it's like, I'm only going to write a few hundred. Let's just do that. Like, write 2 paragraphs. And if it's not happening, I'll come back tomorrow. But usually you end up writing more is what happens.
Yeah, it's always, we like to ask because, sometimes writers have these elaborate rituals that they have to do before they can get something done. And at other times we've had people be like, I just make a cup of coffee and like sit down.
That's me. I mean, I'm the guy. My wife's always like, what did you say? And I'm like, oh, I'm just talking to myself.
Yeah,
I'm doing dialogue. And I approach my characters a lot like, I'm not an actor, but I obviously work with actors when I direct. So I think of it as an actor. Like, how do I get inside this person's head? What would they do? It's not necessarily what Josh would do. It's what would this person do in this situation? And then it has to be justified. You can make people do anything when you write, right? You can write whatever you want. But if it doesn't make sense, like what a person would do, people aren't going to buy in and they're not going to commit. So you have to set these things up to happen, and then it feels inevitable. And I keep saying inevitable, but I think that's important. Like when someone reads something and they feel, it's like, yeah, that's what it should have been. And I was surprised at this moment. I didn't see that coming, but it had to be that way.
Yeah. I know Aaron Sorkin says that too, where he said he almost acts out every piece of back and forth as he's writing it down to make sure that it works right. But
Yeah,
I think
that,
what you're talking about is that's the intangible part of the kind of creative process, right? Like it has to feel like it was always there. It was inevitable. It was always going to be this direction. It was always going to be these words in this order by, it has to feel that way. And it's because it's so hard to describe. It's so hard to latch onto, but it the minute you see it, it the minute you read it, the minute you hit cut, you just kind of are like, oh yes, that was it. That was it. Yeah. And there's no faking it. There's no phoning it in. Exactly. And again, we like talking about because it's so hard to describe and talk about, but this is a podcast where we try to. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's very true of movies. I mean, you have to have a crazy plan when you're a director, right? You have your shot list, you have your beat list, you have your action words you're going to give your actors, but you can't over direct them either. I mean, some people do. I don't. I like to let the actor act. And you should cast people who are going to do the thing you already sort of imagined. And like I said earlier, I know I'm 8% there on the pages. I like my actors to be like 90% of the way there already. And It's like you're just on the day, little adjustments, let them do their thing. Because, I mean, when I was first starting out, you start telling them, okay, well, here's the backstory. And you're talking to them, talking to them. And I had an actor look at me like, what? And I was like, forget everything I just said and do X. And they were like, oh, and they looked at me like, okay, yeah, I get that. Like, it was like one action where it was like, just go attack him. Just go do that. And it was like, okay, I can do that. But like, you give them the word soup and you give them the dissertation. That's not how people think. That's not how people get into character. And you've taken them out of the moment. So, I mean, all that's important to you. It may not be important to your actor. And I think of that like with my characters too. It's like, how'd they get here? And then let it inform something. But I don't need to tell everyone those things either. It just it builds that lived in feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. That's always interesting too. Cause I mean, there's always debates and I didn't plan on asking you about this, but I mean, there's always like kind of like the tyrant director versus kind of like the actor's director, like as they would say, right? Like the actors love this director. It's like, yeah, but but is the movie good? Right. And it's like, oh, he was a tyrant on set. It's like, yeah, but was the movie good? Like kind of like
that's true. But I mean, I'm a nice guy. I try to be more in the camp of helping people. I mean, obviously when you make a movie, it's high stakes and people's tempers flare. Not with the actors, though. They flare with the crew usually, but and people bickering about things. But it's personalities. It's still people, and you have to like live in the reality of like that person doesn't want to walk barefoot across the dirt. Okay, I got to figure out how to do it. Like I'm annoyed that they're not going to do it, but like that's the reality. And USC was very big on safety too. I think that's so important because when I think tyrant director too, I think sometimes people get so lost. And they're like, you go on that. I mean, the famous one obviously was when that indie movie had people on that train track, and they didn't have control of that train track. And like I hear that, and I'm like, how could you not have control of the train track and you have people standing on the dark thing? It makes no sense. I mean, it's a movie. Like,
Right.
no one should die for your movie, and no one should get hurt for your movie. I mean, obviously accidents happen, but you as the director should protect your actors and protect your crew and try to create a safe environment for them to feel vulnerable enough to do the things you want them to do. And obviously there's the people who do 150 takes and get that. And if you're making an indie movie, though, I got news for you. You don't have time to do 150 takes. And if you want any shots diversity, you better be moving on and getting your stuff in a take or two and getting on to the next shot, because you can only do so many setups in a day.
Yeah, I wonder how much of that is imagined too. You know, like everybody's like, "Oh, I'm Stanley Kubrick and I can do 150 takes or something till we get the perfect one." It's one, that era is probably over, like in terms of that, but also just kind of, you know, yeah, that guy got away with it because one, he put out a lot of good stuff, and two, it was just a different, you know, there was no safety coordinators or like liability waivers signed, but he was making these, you know, a legal team coming in. I don't know. I mean, and then people think that that's the art as opposed to, you know, the final product is the art, not how you did it. You know, like it's well,
like
I
in
guess
my
it
movie,
matters, but
actors were in water. It was very cold, so we had the plunge tank with the heater, and they were in wetsuits, and you're trying to make that not look bad. But like, I think there are probably people who said no wetsuits, but we just painted it out in post and made it work. I mean, it was flesh-colored wetsuits, but you could tell too. And
right.
You fix that, and it's not about, I mean, and again, the shot you think you need to get is probably different than the one you want to get to. And that's so important too. And sometimes just letting the camera roll a little longer, like you thought it was, you're like, people think, okay, well, I'm doing this word to this word, and that's the shot. And I think that, but then I usually let people keep going.
Right.
And sometimes the shot, and they stand up, and all of a sudden the camera does this, and they follow them, and they're like, wow, that looks amazing. And like, look at the trees behind them. And like, that wasn't my plan.
Right.
Right. But now that's the shot. Right. And this is the shot, and we need to get that in the movie. But you let them do their thing, and you let your good camera person do their thing and follow and grab the focus. And if you're too in control, you're not going to have that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I mean, the discovery process is part of it, right? So like, yeah, your job is directing, okay, here's the structure, the parameter, but also we have to be willing to make adjustments, whether that's, you know, actors making complaints or something going off or going different, you know, like, and then you craft it. Like, that's the art of the director, right? Like, yeah. That's...
Well, and sometimes they stand up and they move, and you're like, you pan with them, you're like, oh yeah, we're on a set, and there's lights up there, so I guess I guess that's the end of it. Cut, right? But like, you know, it should be fun still. It's stressful, but like, you got to find a way to like live in the moment too. Cause like I said earlier, I mean, if you're making your first, it might be your last, or you might not get to make one for a while. So like, you got to like be in the moment and live with it and do the best you can too.
That's fantastic. Fantastic. Another thing we like to ask everybody on here, and we don't need anything specific, we don't need specific numbers or anything like that, but we like to ask artists and writers that come on here, how do you make a living? You know, do you make any money off of the literature, the movies? Do you have to have the day job? Like, the reason we ask this is because, you know, it's tough out there for creatives, and just kind of, we like to dissolve the illusion that everybody out there doing something like this is a millionaire. And like I said, we don't need any numbers or anything, but just how do you make a living? Do you make any money off of the creative stuff? Or...
And I mentioned it at the top. I mean, I worked with my dad in sales, and I kept doing that because it's a good way to make money and have some freedom to do it. And that's not a very exciting thing to tell people. I mean, Herman Melville worked in a freaking warehouse, like stamping books, and no one even heard of him until he was dead. So I don't want to be that guy. But you have to, I mean, if you're just you can be that poor artist. But as you get older, I mean, I'm married, I have 2 kids.
Right.
You have to feed them. And until you find that success, I think you have to live in a reality of the world we live in too. And I think it's so important to be able to pay your bills, obviously, but then you have to time block. And maybe it's not the optimal time that you wish it was, but one day, hopefully you'll get to have that optimal time. And, you know, the book just came out, but the sales have already been good. So, you know, I'm not going to win the lottery here, but it's definitely money coming in, and there will be some money. But I think, again, I didn't do this to get rich, and I knew that. And my parents were both very successful, and I've seen that, and I try to. I want my kids to have that life too. So it has to be a balance,
Right.
you know. And my wife is a very successful entrepreneur as well, and she does well, and we're a team, and she's always supported me in my endeavors too. And I feel very fortunate in that too, because I don't think everyone would necessarily be on board with
Right.
the lifestyle of a creative. And she's always supported me, and my parents were always very encouraging too, to chase your dreams. And I know that's not everyone's story, but it was mine, and I feel very lucky in that sense too.
I think it was for millennials. That was I said, like almost every millennial creative I made, like it's very rarely do they have that kind of boomer Gen X story where, oh, mom and daddy didn't understand. It was always like, no, it's like, you know, we were born in the 80s. Like our parents were like, yeah, go ahead. You know, like they're very supportive. Oh, well, if that's what you want to do, like give it your all, you know, we'll be here. And I'm always like, whenever somebody, it's almost rarer to have the opposite of that now. If somebody's like, oh, you know, my dad hated this, you know, Francis Ford Coppola kind of, you know, oh, my dad always discouraged me. I was like, I never met anybody, even in my art degree, you know, like programs where that was the case. But I'm sure there's some still.
I think that it's real though, because I mean,
Yeah,
obviously there are some people who have the wherewithal to never work and they can do whatever they want. But most of us have to have a job. And I think a lot of creatives get really discouraged and they feel like, and I was like this too. I was like, I have to just be a filmmaker. And I've gotten away from that. I was like, I wouldn't tell people the other stuff I did. I was like, oh, I just do this. And I mean, that's just like, who cares? Right. At the end of the day, I think you can't compare yourself to other people. Like I said at the top, I've had some friends have great success. I've had some people not have great success. And I just try to support everyone and be a cheerleader for my friends. And then hopefully people are cheering for me too. And you just got to keep chasing it because you're passionate about it.
Yeah, and what more could you ask for in terms of, you know, you're getting to write the books, you're getting to make the movies, and you're still making a living with the day job, and like that's still like,
and like hopefully one day I'm, you know, we all have the dream that we'll be J.K. Rowling and be making billions of dollars, and I don't need billions, millions are okay, but you know, I definitely want to have success with it, and I keep pushing that, and you know, it's just a journey. Who knows where the destination is. I think when you start, and I think millennials too, we look at like some of the guys who came and gals who came up in the 70s and the 80s. Oh, I'm going to be like Steven Spielberg. I'm going to be like, that world just doesn't exist anymore. I mean, George Lucas got the toy rights to Star Wars. I mean, come on. Like, you would never get that deal. And like, to even get to make another one is like, who knows if that's even in the deal, that they'll even let you come back. I mean, if it's not negotiated in there. So, I mean, those days are long past. So I don't think you can hold up those. There's the new path, and we have to make it. And I learned that very quickly at USC, because you start asking all these professors. Oh, I had like a great producing professor who wrote Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. He did Backdraft. It's like you start asking what his journey was, and you're like, you very quickly realize, well, I don't think that journey is even possible now.
Right.
And I have to find my own journey, and I have to find my own path. And I still go back to those people and tell them what I'm up to. And, you know, they're cheerleaders too. And they know they struggled too. You see them as success, but they've had failures. You don't hear about the movies they didn't get to make. And maybe they had their heyday in the 90s and they still want to make more, right? I think like sometimes you like sunset these people and people are still I mean, look at Ridley Scott. He's still out there in his 80s doing this thing, right? So I think everyone's journey is different. And I think you just have to get it out there and get your best work out there, but don't let that limit you in getting it out there too. Because if you don't get it out there, no one knows who you are.
Yeah, that was going to be another question we like to ask is what advice would you give people starting out? And I think that's because I think that is something that people don't realize that, when we could talk about the greats of the boomers, you know, that came of age in the 70s and, you know, made all this great art that we all still love and cherish. It's over. I remember doing that, like even in grad school for writing, you know, I didn't do film, but I did for creative writing. All the professors, they have their books out, you know, they did their kind of path. And even they were kind of just like, look, like that doesn't really work anymore. It used to be you could go get your MFA and then get your book published on an indie press, and then you'd probably get a job somewhere, being like a teacher or something, even if it wasn't a big press. And that just doesn't exist anymore. You know, now you have to have 3 or 4 books and 50,000 people following you on Twitter or something, and then you get like a job. It's different than what it was. It's more competitive. More people are trying to do it, and it just it's useful to look at the past, but I think you're 100% right that it's a different time now, different paths to get there, and we have to kind of discover them, just like the boomers did back then, where they just discovered it. Yeah.
And there's plenty of boomers who were around those guys who didn't make it.
Right.
We never heard of them too. So, I mean, don't think they all made it. And I met some of those professors too, and they're very successful, creative people, but like, they were like one step away from being the James Cameron or something, but they didn't, that thing didn't happen for them. And that's just life. And I mean, we're not the sum of our accomplishments, and and I mean, I feel very lucky. I mean, I've made a movie, I've made a book, but like, even I'm like, oh, I got to do more. I haven't done enough. What am I doing? Like, and you take a step back. It's like, chill out, keep doing it. These things take time. We talked about that at the top. I mean, they take forever, and it's just a journey. And I keep saying that, but it's true. I mean, it's got to be a process.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing we like to ask here, and this can be anything, we like to ask, are you reading anything good, watching anything good, listening to anything good, anything that you would recommend? And we ask this question because, everything you kind of consume fills your head creatively and kind of comes out almost in a subconscious way. So we like to just ask all the creatives that come on, what are you into right now? Any books, movies, TV shows, music, whatever, podcasts, radio play, whatever, that's all these mediums. What's filling your head right now? What are you?
Well, I've been reading to my kids. I read to my kids every night, and we've been reading the Wandla series, which we've been really enjoying. And I think that it's just cool. My kids want me to write a middle grade YA book, so that's been fun. And I've kind of been in that headspace a little bit, like, okay, what could my middle grade YA? What's the PGG version of Shadow of the Eternal Watcher, right? And then, so that's been fun. And TV wise, Severance is great. We love Severance, and we've been into that. And White Lotus is back now, so we're excited about that. and catching up on all the Oscar noms, and just watched Demi Moore's performance the other night. So just trying to, always be doing stuff. And then book-wise, I mentioned Rob Hart, just finished one of his books. I also do a lot of nonfiction, so I'm doing a book about the Plantagenets right now that's really quite good. And that's my audiobook when I'm driving around town. I like to listen to my history. So just always, and I say this a lot too. You talked about advice. I think finding time to read. And some people say, oh, I'm a writer who doesn't read. And I just don't even, and I don't mock other people's process. More power to you. But if you can find 10, 15 minutes, time block it. I get this way too. I'm like, I should be answering emails. I should be working. I should be writing. I don't have time to read. But like, I slow myself down. I read. And not because you're not going to, you said bleeds in your subconscious, but I think it just makes you more creative, and you're not going to like copy that. It gets your brain in the right headspace to do these things too. And sometimes you see some of it's technical too. You're like, oh wow, look how they did those commas and those M dashes. That's kind of I've never seen that before. I've never really thought about doing that. I like that. I'm gonna try that in a sentence. I mean, there's the craft of it too, that if you never read a page, how can you possibly think you're going to craft a novel and paint that picture?
Right.
Again, whatever your process is, though, if you want to be a writer, just do too. You have to just do it. You can't just talk about it. You have to find a way to create and produce.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely. It seems like, especially given social media and kind of the media landscape now, let's say it's much easier to talk about and let's say like record ourselves like we're doing right now than it is to sit down and do the work, like
I know. Well, I actually kind of like doing these. I've done a few of them now for the book, and I'm like, I need to do that, don't I? You're right. Like, they're like, what are you working on? I'm like, well, it's true. I am working on the sequel to this, and I did write 1,500 words yesterday. I'm like, what? You got to write it again today, though. Right. You got to keep going. You can't. It'll never get done if you don't. So it's a good reminder for myself too.
Yeah, and the last question we like to ask everybody that comes on: what are you working on now? You said you're doing a sequel to this.
Doing a sequel to Shadow of the Eternal Watcher. following Jester Rains. The book definitely stands on its own, but I left it open for a sequel. And I waited to write it because I was like, well, what notes am I going to get in the publishing process? Am I going to kill someone? Are they going to say you need to end it differently? I didn't know what was going to happen. So I kept waiting to write this book that was burning a hole in my brain. So now I'm finally writing it and got a couple scripts that I'm bouncing around, and my manager's out there pitching me. So just trying to find that next movie too. And like I said, I just am creating more, and I want more. You mentioned 3 or 4 books. That's kind of, now that I've done the one, I'm like, I gotta have more.
Right.
And I hate it, but it's true. And I don't want to just be the one-off guy. And I want people to be able to find me in different ways. So I just keep trying to reach out and touch people and get it into the void. I like to say, shout into the void. And if you don't put it out there, they're never going to find it.
Do you work on multiple projects at once like that, where you do screenplays, and let's say, you're doing a novel one day, you read a couple, like a chapter or a couple 1,000 words, and then you go into, well, this screenplay needs a touch up, and you go do the screenplay the next day, kind of just bouncing around?
I kind of segment more. Like right now I'm really in this book, but I'm sure I'll take a step back from that, and if something is pressing, I can write the script. But I have quite a few scripts, so it's like, well, how many scripts can you write for? If you have an idea that you think, oh, I could make this, cool, but like, you only need so many samples of scripts. Right. So like when they're not getting made, that's what's fun about the book to me, is I know it can be a thing and it can be done, and I don't need $5 million to make it. So that's, and I can hold it, and it's on library shelves now, which is like the childhood dream of mine. So I'm back to where I started, where I'm excited about the novels, and I'm going to just keep writing. And you walk around and tell people you're a writer, and now it's actually true. And I'm like, I want more. Like, I want to have a bunch on the shelves. And I think too, you never know who's going to find what when. I might make the next movie, I might write that next book, and all of a sudden people come back to this one, right? And I have some other books that once I get through this sequel, I'm going to maybe actually go in reverse order. I have a screenplay I love. It's a short film I made at USC that then became a screenplay that I won a bunch of awards for. And then now I'm like, maybe that'd be a good book. Maybe I should go back and dig into that and go. So it's sort of like the opposite of what normally happens. But I think that could be a fun, like, horror thriller suspense novel. So I'm going to get back into that too.
Yeah, I think that's good for creativity, to be bouncing around all these different kind of and even you said like segmenting, because otherwise you never get anything done, so finish this, then I'll bounce back to this, but still like having that almost like a breather for your brain. And then when you come back after you've done that other project, you come back to that novel or whatever, and you're like, oh, it's now I know exactly what to do, kind of just taking a break from it and doing something else. It really, really undervalued how good that is for creative, but yeah, that's fantastic. Josh, this has been fantastic. Where can people find your stuff?
Yeah, so joshmendoza.com is my website. You can get on my newsletter, and that kind of talks about my movie and my different book and writing endeavors. Kind of has a blog on there. I just started that. But on social, you can find me at Mendoza Strikes. I'm out there on Instagram, Facebook. I'm on X, Blue Sky, all the things. And yeah, the book, Shadow of the Eternal Watcher, it's available wherever you like to get your books. There's an audio version as well. It's on Audible and all those different platforms as well. So go into your favorite indie bookstore and tell them to order it. You can do that, or you can just hop on one of the big ones, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and get a copy. I'd love it if you read it. Movie's still out there too, streaming. What Still Remains. You can watch that on Amazon, Tubi, all the things. So go find it, and would love it to connect with you all and hear what you think of the work.
That's fantastic, and that is all linked below as well, listeners, in the description. So go click it and give Josh a read, a like, a subscribe, all that good stuff. But all right, this has been another episode of Heavy Board.
Heavy.
Board.
Heavy.
I am heavy bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. No! Dinner.
Resources.
Life, friends, is boring. We must not say so.
such a lack of gratitude for life. Bored. I aspire to boredom, I should say.
Bored. Heavy.
I am heavy.
Bored.
Has you the night sweats and the day sweats, pal? Pal, I do.
If you're hearing this, it's because you are listening to the free public feed of Heavy Board. To get complete, uncensored, uninterrupted, full access to this podcast, become a subscriber at patreon.com/heavyboard. That's right, Heavy Board is made possible by subscribers like you. For less than 1 cup of coffee per month, you will receive private access to uncensored, full-length episodes, Jerk Shop, heavy bonus content, subscribers-only AMA episodes, bonus extended interviews, and more. Come join the conversation today at patreon.com/heavyboard.